I think we should go ahead and get started. It's great to see everybody, so thank you for coming, and thank you for everybody online joining us. This is, I think of it as sort of the second in a series of conversations that we're having about the future of solar energy. As many of you know, the energy transition that we're going through worldwide to try to tackle climate change entails finding new ways to produce and consume energy around the world that are grounded in non-carbon based forms of energy. If you look at what the International Energy Agency has developed in recent years, if you look at the Solar Future study that was done by the US Department of Energy, you look at any number of reports that have come out in the last few years about how we're going to get to carbon neutrality as a US economy and as a global economy. One of the most consistent features of those is that something like half or more of our future energy supply is going to have to come through solar panels, and which means that solar is in some sense quite literally the next oil. And so one of the questions that I have had for a long time and that I think is particularly important is, what are the human dimensions of living in that future in which we get a lot of our energy from the sun? And there's a really cool community of writers out there who have been writing about solar futures called the Solarpunk community, and it's super exciting for us to have Phoebe Wagner here today to talk with us about Solarpunk writing, Solarpunk futures, and this topic of hers of writing the Anthropocene. Right? How do we write about a world in which we are grappling with climate change, and at the same time we are simultaneously grappling with what it will mean for ourselves to rewrite the technological foundations of our societies and our economies in ways that don't continue to disrupt the future of the climate. Phoebe is a professor at Lycoming College in Pennsylvania. I think I got that right. She is a longtime editor of some of the key Solarpunk collections. It's interesting. The field that we're part of has had a long history of writing edited collections, which are not so prominent in other fields. And it's interesting that Solarpunk is very similar. A lot of the writing and a lot of the most important writing has appeared in these edited collections, which makes it different from other kinds of science fiction in that regard. So she edited Sunvault, which was in 2017, a collection of science fiction stories about Solarpunk, or in the Solarpunk tradition. And then more recently, she's published something called Almanac for the Anthropocene, which is an attempt to bridge the conversation between people who are trying to write about Solarpunk futures and people who are trying to bring about Solarpunk in sort of inspired innovation in the world around us, which is a really interesting collection of writing. And then she's also a science fiction writer herself, and she has a new novel. Is it out? Or
April 18th.
April 18th.
Yeah.
That's exciting. Called A Shot of Gin, and a novella, When We Hold Each Other Up. It's also later this year.
That's the April one. The novel's in October.
Okay, so novella in April and the novel in October, first ones. That's super
Mhm.
exciting.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So Phoebe, it's all yours. We're super excited to have you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's so exciting to be here at ASU because ASU was such an early adopter of Solarpunk. And so to be here where so much of that inspiration was coming from is really exciting. So I just have the screen turned on when you're ready. And of course, thank you to Clark for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. So it's been a very delightful time in Phoenix so far. Just turn this a little bit more.
Oh, yeah.
No, you're good. There we go. All right, awesome. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about, from a storyteller's perspective, I do come at this as a science fiction fantasy writer. And so I want to talk a little bit about hopeful stories and how that can impact a sustainable energy culture. We know that imagination is a powerful tool and that literature has also been used to create harm as well as to bring about better worlds. And we also know that science fiction specifically has been involved in innovating technology and changing how we think about technology that we currently use today. One of the easiest examples is, of course, the Star Trek communicator being an inspiration for the early cell phone design, which has, of course, morphed into this very science fiction piece of technology with our smartphones, right? And then, of course, William Gibson's cyberpunk work started to influence how we thought early on about the internet, even with his usage of the word cyberspace, right? Which became part of our vocabulary when thinking about the internet. So science fiction in particular has had an impact on how we think, how literature helps us think about technology, innovation, and also changes our society. One of the things that drew me to Solarpunk in particular early on was this concern that in sort of post 9/11 in the US, we started to see a lot of dystopias. And that was we were seeing a lot of them come out, and I was starting to worry, if that's all we're going to imagine is a dystopic future, then what are we going to create? Doesn't that start to limit our options? And I'm not the first one to, of course, be thinking about this. Our literary theorist, Frederick Jameson, has famously said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And if we were to start thinking about a couple of books or movies or things that do this, we'd easily come up with a couple of different ideas. Mad Max Fury Road is the one that always comes to mind. But importantly, what Frederick Jameson says is not so much the presence of an enemy, whether that's capitalism or some other social ill, but rather it's this idea of universal belief that is a problem. This idea that capitalism is the only economic and social cultural form, right? That universal belief in that. That's where we have a sticking point. And we know that stories contribute to universal belief. We've seen this in literature before. And where I study environmental literature, we see this in early environmental literature around ideas of the frontier and things like that. We see it around this idea of capitalism, right? The failure of capitalism is associated with the end of the world quite often, rather than the reverse, right? How often do you see the failure of capitalism and something better build out of the ashes? That's a lot harder to find. And we also already know that stories can create change, whether it's early abolitionist writers or, of course, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is a really easy one to pull up. But importantly, as we move ahead and we start to experience more drastically the impacts of climate change, one of the things that many of us in this room will probably experience at some point is a climate disaster or a major climate event, right? And so disaster studies points out that there is an astonishing gap between common beliefs and actualities about disaster behavior that limits the possibilities. And so this always blows my students' minds when I start to talk to them about it. It's like, can you tell me a story where there isn't violence after a disaster, right? And they can't. They've never thought about this before, that pop culture almost always universally after a disaster displays communities disrupting into violence, or men with guns, as I like to put it, violent people coming into that community, which is actually not the case. Disaster studies, and Rebecca Solnit points this out in her book, Paradise Built in Hell, that this is not usually actually what happens. We have evidence to the contrary. But even so, this still impacts how we think about those disaster situations. In particular, Rebecca Solnit talks about Katrina and how Katrina, people in Louisiana and New Orleans were impacted by these ideas as false narratives were spread by the press and by sheriffs and the police that fit this more popular narrative. So then as we start thinking about climate disasters impacting the US as well as other parts of the world, what narratives are we telling? How are we impacting this idea of universal belief, right? And how can we start to switch that? Now, as a science fiction writer and as someone working with Solarpunk, I definitely believe that science fiction is a huge tool for us to be able to do this, mainly because we are starting to recognize that science fiction is a way of organizing the world. Scholar Cicerone points this out. He calls it science fictionality, a way of thinking about the world. But he points out that it goes beyond fandom, beyond passion, to a way of envisioning the world, questioning, but also importantly, play, right? So it becomes more of an organizing principle rather than just a genre. And Adrienne Marie Brown has her own take on this. She's a scholar activist known for her book Emergent Strategy. She calls it science fictional behavior. How do actions and beliefs shape tomorrow, which is a similar idea. Importantly, though, she develops this through the concept of the imagination battle, as she frames it. And she says that we are in one, and gives an example of what is going on with this imagination battle. Things like the American dream, borders, racial superiority, things that are entirely imaginary. But they are winning, right? These are cultural ideas that we have right now. So she says that I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's imagination, and I must engage my own imagination to break free. So we know that this idea of stories is already being used on the other side when we're thinking about American dream, borders, things like that. So this is a tool that we can start to use, right, to change how we think about climate change. Now, importantly, though, we do have struggles when writing climate change literature or environmental literature, and this has been talked about through several of our theorists over in literature. Tom Ghosh says that climate change resists serious fiction, though he doesn't think a wholesale switch to science fiction is the answer either. Rob Nixon talks about slow violence and how we need to consider time, because while a superstorm might take over the headlines for a day or two, as that community continues to suffer the impacts of that storm, they're not going to be in the headlines anymore. So what do we do after that? How do we cut through this sort of apocalyptic noise from not only the headlines, but also in the US, our political system being on that 4-year or 2-year turnaround? And then, of course, the publishing industry is a petroculture, right? Like it is using fossil fuels as well. So how is the publishing industry going to adapt, and can they adapt? Publishing has not been very good at adapting, as we've seen from the 2008 financial crisis, as well as during COVID. So what's going to happen to the publishing industry and how we get stories out to people as climate change and the need to turn to sustainable energy impacts publishing as well? So here's where I think Solarpunk can start to come in as a specific subgenre of science fiction. So if you Google Solarpunk, you'll find different definitions. But one of the things that I like to operate from is a 3-part definition that I think sort of starts to cover a little bit of the genre. So Solarpunk literature imagines new futures in the midst of and in opposition to environmental collapse, and then works to create those futures. Solarpunk stories must recognize the climate crisis and environmental collapse as entangled issues that include all oppressive systems. And importantly, there is no environmental justice without racial and decolonial justice. And these are some of the ways that it starts to separate from environmental literature in general, and some of the markers that it has that separates it from those stories. Now, some of you probably already know a little bit about Solarpunk, but I wanted to just do a very brief history. So it's relatively new. First time the term was used, as far as we know, was 2008. It grew in popularity via social media. The first anthology came out in 2012, importantly in Brazil. As much as I'll be talking about Solarpunk in a US context, it is very global. Like it is active in many different parts of the world. And so I'm just speaking from my US experience, but I want to make sure and emphasize that. Solarpunk Notes Toward a Manifesto by Adam Flynn came out actually from an ASU project, and that has been a very formative piece of Solarpunk literature. And then Sunball, which is what I co-edited, came out in 2017, and it was the first general English anthology of Solarpunk, including poetry, art, as well as fiction, with the goal of kind of starting to put some shape and form to what Solarpunk could be, starting to set some ideas, okay, what are the possibilities here, and what's the spectrum of Solarpunk? And since then, it's really grown. There's been a lot of different pieces of art, games, short fiction. We're starting to see some novels and novellas come out, things like that. Importantly, though, it hasn't really had what I call like a Blade Runner piece of pop culture, something that like Blade Runner cemented cyberpunk, which is an early sort of forefather of Solarpunk. We haven't really had something like that come through. So in that sense, it's still very focused in on like small creators and is not necessarily fully known unless you're into science fiction and fantasy more specifically. Now, some reasons why I think we need Solarpunk stories as opposed to just science fiction stories, and a couple of things. We already know that climate change cannot be solved in the way that it's often depicted in other stories. At this point, we're still going to feel the impacts. Even if we went carbon neutral tomorrow, we're still going to be feeling impacts, and that also it's going to continue to impact communities. We also need to take into consideration things that we don't always associate directly with global warming. So history of pollution, resource extraction, colonialism, environmental racism, and how, while all of those are entangled with climate change, those impacts are not going to go away culturally with us getting off of fossil fuels. We also have to recognize that government intervention is often slow, particularly in rural and poor communities, and that going back to disaster studies and Rebecca Solnit, the local community is the first boots on the ground, right? Like it's communities coming together and helping each other during disaster scenarios. That is the first people that's going to be involved. So with those things in mind, we have to start thinking about how can we work toward a better future, and what can we importantly imagine. Now, Solarpunk stories are actually some of the hardest stories I write. I also write just broadly in fantasy and science fiction, but whenever I sit down to write a Solarpunk story, it is the most difficult work I have to do, usually because Solarpunk is pushing back against a universal belief, right? And that universal belief is supported by stories. And the tools we have to write stories are also part of what's contributing to that universal belief. So what I have up here is a list of things. I'm a creative writing professor at my small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, and these are the types of things that I teach my students. I explain to them this is what is considered good writing in the US. And there's a couple of things that Solarpunk really pushes back against, in particular, a beginning, middle, and end, and resolution. How can we do that when we don't see a resolution with climate change right now? How can we start to tell that story with this tool if it's not possible, right? Well, how do we have to rethink storytelling? And so that's one of the major questions I'm always asking myself when I'm working on Solarpunk literature is, how do I actually tell the story that needs to be told while pushing back against these ideas, right, that have continued to support a universal belief up until now. So I want to give you just a couple examples of Solarpunk stories or Solarpunk prompts, just to kind of help you think about what a story might be, short of like reading something. So a couple of examples here. One that I particularly like is the first one: how do a group of cooks, dietitians, and teachers create and promote well-rounded and tasty vegan, vegetarian cuisine in a world living through the culture shock of no affordable meat? And one of the things I think this is a great example of a Solarpunk prompt is because it's looking at culture shock, right? This is a cultural change that's happening. It's not that we don't have the option to have vegan and vegetarian food in this world. It's that it's a shift in thinking around that. And it's part of an adaptation, right? Things are changing in the culture. It's become too expensive. So in order to adapt, communities have to change the way they eat, which is a cultural idea, right? So I really like that shift that's being suggested in that example. How do communities relocate into sustainable housing after climate disasters, adjust to losing their old homes to floods, fires, and relocation programs? So once again, it's a shift in thinking, it's a shift in the way these people view the world, and also recognizing this is hard. Like there is grief involved, there is sadness and anger involved in this, right? And so these people are going to have to adjust. And then one of my favorites at the bottom: how might modified mushrooms remove pollutants from the Midwest soil, but also network a community? And I love this idea of how thinking about what if we were able to experiment more directly with mushrooms, what might come from that, right? And how could they be used to address climate issues? In addition to how can we learn about community from the way that mushrooms connect to each other? And so I think this is also another great example of Solarpunk thinking. So what about the solar and Solarpunk? So clearly solar, everything that comes to mind is going to be solar panels, right? And as you saw from an earlier picture, solar panels are definitely a trope in Solarpunk. Like you're going to see them in almost every Solarpunk story. But at the same time, I oftentimes look at solar too as a little bit more expansive. Like this is connective, right? The sun connects us in a variety of ways, provides energy, provides growth. And so there's a lot of different ways to play with the solar in Solarpunk, but certainly solar panels are a big one. And that's why I was so excited when I was editing Almanac for the Anthropocene, which is a peer-reviewed collection of essays, some of them more academic, some more public-facing. But one came in from a geologist friend of mine, Gabriel Aliaga. And one of the things that he's pointed out and asked a question of is, does Solarpunk imagine a future without mining? I think the average Solarpunk would say, yes, of course. Of course, we don't want to continue mining. Like, we don't want to continue disrupting these things or continuing the extractive practices and the negative practices, at least not on the scale we're doing now. But then how do we have solar panels? Even if we're recycling 100% of the time once they wear out in 25 years, how do we make sure that we all have enough, right? And so this starts to present some sticky questions that I think Solarpunk actually needs to start wrestling with. It's very easy to sort of hand wave away the technology. And I'm guilty of this too. When I'm writing Solarpunk stories, I put solar panels all over the place. But at the same time, I'm not showing where is that coming from? Like, where are those materials coming from? What is happening after the materials have reached the end of their life? What does that actually look like? And so this is an easy thing that Solarpunk does that I think is good, right? It's important to start showing that cultural change, but at the same time, we have to start thinking about what do we do with mining? How do we do this in a way that is sustainable, in a way that is also just and not taking advantage of other people and other nations? And what does that look like? And as my friend, the geologist, so sort of pithily put it, land disturbance is the cost of replacing your cell phone. And I think there he actually really hit the nail on the head. It's a cultural shift, right? Like, let's say we had the ability to sustainably create cell phones, and that's not a problem anymore, which we do have technology that can start pushing us in that direction, right? But if we have the cultural idea that every year we're going to buy a new cell phone because Apple put out the new one, we're going to have the same problem. That doesn't fix the issue, right? It just pushes it off a little farther into the future. So what we really need to start thinking about is a cultural change in our relationship to energy, which also is our relationship to capitalism and consumerism to some degree. So as I said earlier, I'm very much approaching this from a storyteller's perspective. You all have more of the engineering expertise in the room, but I think coming together is a way that we can start to promote that cultural shift. And I do think science fiction and fantasy has the potential to influence our thinking around that, because we've seen it work in other places, right? We've seen it promote innovation. We've seen it start to change ideas around people, places, and things. And I think Solarpunk is an important part of this because it's already thinking about progress. So the Western notion of progress is usually, whether technological or social, in a straight line, right? We're always trying to do better, create the next iteration that's better, create the next thing that's better, right? We're going in that line forward into unlimited growth and productivity. That's usually our notion of progress, right? And Solarpunk wants to undermine that. Rather, the focus on technology in Solarpunk, and the way that I've defined it since Sunvault, is this idea of the right tool for the right job. So sometimes it is creating a more efficient solar panel. Sometimes it is creating a new piece of code, but sometimes it's also using a shovel, right? The shovel does not have to be smart. It can just be an effective shovel. And sometimes that's the right tool for the right job. It's not always about the new. So how do we integrate our cultural ideals around technology? How do we interrogate our cultural ideals around technology? How do we start to change what we think of when we think of progress and shift to this idea of the right piece of technology for the right tool? And that's where I think science and storytelling coming together can be a very powerful thing. So I identify 3 cultural shifts that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. First one being that we can't just green the American dream, that we need to dismantle it and rethink it. Because if we continue on just with consuming, but we're just consuming sustainable, quote unquote, sustainable things instead, that's not going to work. That's the same idea that got us here in the first place. Create a new or return to more of a sustainable energy culture, which is going to be a cultural shift from what we experience now. And then also, this has to be pleasurable. Like, this has to be desirable. If we don't create a future that people want, if we don't look towards that and imagine that future, then no one's going to want it. So we need to be moving out away from like a scarcity mindset. So sustainability ultimately cannot be an excuse for growth. If we continue in that direction, then we're just going to end up in the similar situation, just with a different flavor, a different idea. Rather, sustainability has to lead towards adaptation. If we're adapting and using that technology to help communities adapt locally to the impacts in their area, that's where sustainable technology is going to help us. So what does a sustainable energy culture look like? And right now, it has a tendency to look like this, right? We've started to see these advertisements. So, you know, a 3-bedroom house with solar panels slapped on top. And that's continuing this idea of the American dream, right? That we have this house that is now sustainable in some form or fashion with these solar panels. But of course, that's separating it by wealth, right? Like, it's people who are of a higher class that can afford these solar panels in the US. And it's also their desire. It's starting to become a neoliberal idea that, oh, we're going to save the planet by doing this, right? Whereas if you're a poor person, you're turning off the light because you're trying to lower your energy bill, not because it's better for the planet, right? So there's this situation that's showing up between our wealth disparity. The same thing we can see it also is not just around solar panels, right? It's regional food, it's the ability to repair something rather than just go out and buy a cheap new version. And all these things are becoming separated by wealth. And also being associated with the new American dream, as I think Kevin Bacon's electric vehicle commercial, if all of you have seen that, starts to demonstrate as well, right? So it's not that we don't want to just continue to have the same American culture and slap like electric vehicles and solar panels on it. If we keep the same car culture that we oftentimes had in wealthy parts of the world, where we get a new car every other year, but instead it's an electric vehicle, that's still going to cause problems down the line. So we need to shift this idea, whether it's solar panels or electric cars. So ultimately, one of the things I'm trying to figure out is, how do we tell stories where the world, the characters, the narrative demonstrate a different culture and a different way of living? And so ultimately, we're going to have these new imaginaries. I always like to turn to the Marvel Cinematic Universe to kind of get a sense of where we're sitting as a culture. I think it's an underlooked sort of thumb on the finger on the pulse of kind of what's going on. And here we see that myth of progress, right? Like, they're always like building better robots, they're building better computers, building better AI, building better technology. And sure, they can say it's sustainable, but they never show you how it is, right? All of Iron Man's labs were sustainable, right? But it's like, what does that even mean? That's 100% like, what do you mean? And so I think we need to start shifting away from this continual myth of progress, this continual consumption, and instead start showing, like, how do we actually do this work? And then, though, importantly, the counter narratives have to be just as attractive, right? They have to be just as enjoyable in some way as the MCU, as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I've had a couple of shots from Dear Alice, which is a short minute and 30-second just short animation, very Studio Ghibli style animation. And that's what this clip or this shot is also from. And one of the reasons I like this is because it's beautiful, right? Like, look at that. Like, even if maybe that's not your ideal place to live, you can see why, like, yeah, that's a pretty great future. I'd take that. And what's fascinating though, and you can't see it here, it's also a Chobani yogurt ad. And something that I think is important is that Solarpunk is marketable in a way that people are already starting to tap into, whether it's this ad. Disney has had some sort of Solarpunk-esque stuff that's kind of like creeping around the edge of some of their work. And there's been other companies that have also used it for a different marketing. IKEA did another one. And we've also seen a lot of Bitcoin people try to tap into Solarpunk marketing. And so it definitely presents a desirable idea. One of the reasons I like this shot is because we have so much going on in it, right? We have an agricultural setting that is clearly supporting some sort of green city in the background. We have sustainable technology that's integrated right into the farm, right? Whether it's the solar panels or the wind. I love you can just barely see sort of the green creeping up the tie line, right? We also have a silo that's been adapted and repurposed to some sort of, looks like maybe hot house or something like that. Domes are another Solarpunk trope. You will see domes all over the place in Solarpunk. And I am also guilty of this. I have written about domes. But then also too, we also have a bicycle that's just a bicycle, right? That's one of the things I love about it. Nothing's really changed about it. It's just there. It's a tool that is working. And so they leave it the way it is. It doesn't have to be a smart bike or electric bike even. It's just a bicycle. It's a tool, the right tool for the right job, right? Nothing needed to be updated there. So this is some of the ways that I think Solarpunk can start to be countercultural. It's already shown to be somewhat desirable if we're seeing marketing people tap into it, right? Like they're going to know better than us about how that could work. But now we need to focus in on the countercultural aspect. In the novella that I have coming out in April, I was really trying to think about this and try and tell a story where I could play around with some of these ideas. And one of the first things I focused on was storytelling, trying to tackle and push back against the universal belief. How do we examine the story that created these myths, whether it's the myth of progress, capitalism, eternal growth, or racial myths, white supremacy, colonialism, things like that? How do we start to tackle those stories and dismantle them and tell different stories? Importantly, returning to other knowledge systems, right? Like there have been people in the past who have been sustainable and people who are sustainable now. How do we connect to those communities in a meaningful way in the US through our literary cultures? But also creating new cultures, telling new stories. For example, what does a queer normative community look like? You know, I think very few of us are able to really walk into a community that is queer normative here in the US, right? We still have the overarching issues of patriarchy, hierarchy, sexism, heteronormativity that come in. So like, what would a community look like that did not grow up with those pieces, right? That's what I mean when I'm saying create different cultures. So these new depictions of a world and culture, specifically thinking about consumption based on need. So this idea that it's not coming from scarcity, which we see in some proto-Solarpunk stories like The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, which as much as I love that book, does have a scarcity-based anarchist system. So rather than thinking about that, how about just on need, right? Not excess or consuming more than is needed, but just the right tool for the right job, the right amount of energy for the right job. But at the same time, making sure that there's no reduction in the way that people enjoy their lives, that there's still that desirability. And finding that pleasure in other ways, right? So one of the ways that a lot of Solarpunk does this is through the ideas of community. A lot of Solarpunk stories are reimagining healthier communities, communities that come together in times of struggle, a focus on really healthy personal relationships, and also a focus on beloved spaces and trying to save those spaces, whether it's natural spaces or urban spaces, as well as different forms of art. And I think that's all very exciting ways that Solarpunk is redefining culture and rethinking through some of these ideas. And then that changes how our relationship to energy usage, right? And so telling stories where oftentimes I do this through world building, or in the background of the world, there'll be a focus on like, okay, here's the sustainable technology. While there needs to be more wrestling with where does that sustainable technology ultimately come from, at the same time, having that idea that we're having a different relationship with energy that is not a growth mindset, but simply the right tool for the right job, and also focusing on local adaptation. In this book in particular, I had 4 communities that I had my main characters visit, and each one had different relationships with energy, all the way from a group that used very little energy and chose to live in a more primitive manner, all the way to a high-tech archivist group that is like, that was their purpose, was to have archives that were digitally networked that people could access. And thinking about, and that was how they interacted with energy. So kind of on a different scale. And then ultimately too, one of the things I really like that Solarpunk can do is help us to start rethinking different places that we have right now that are sort of like sitting and taking up energy and taking up space in our own lives and our own communities. Prisons is a great example. We talk about that quite a bit in Almanac for the Anthropocene and pushing back against the prison industrial complex, but also golf courses, right? Something that takes a lot of water and a lot of energy to maintain. How can those be returned to community spaces while also still leaving space for the people who enjoy the sport, right? Not reducing that pleasure. And then malls, right? We have so many big empty malls. Maybe not here in Phoenix where it seems like you're building a lot, but at least in Pennsylvania, there is a lot of empty malls and empty storefronts. And so how can we reimagine those spaces and then create pathways that we can start to do something with those spaces? So I think Solarpunk should also be practical in that way. If you can reimagine what a mall space might look like, then can you start to push your community and help your community to actually make that happen, right? So I very much believe a story can be a toolkit, that you can learn from a story, practical things, take it into your life, and then put it back out in your community. So that we're not just inspiring, but we're also starting to teach the change in meaningful ways. This is something I think about a lot as an editor. So I have a new anthology coming out this summer, Fighting for the Future, which is Cyberpunk stories to Solarpunk stories with the transitional stories in between. So thinking about how do we go from our cyberpunk reality to a solarpunk reality. And importantly, I was very much looking for and really adamant to have a story that was set in the near future that used technology very similar to what we have available now. That was also specific and a toolkit, practical in some meaningful way. And what I found was The Strength of the Willow by Commando Jugendstil and Tales from the EV Studio. They're solarpunks based in Italy and in the UK. And one of the things I loved about their story, it was about bottom-up resistance. So there was a community space that the government did not want to see in operation because they wanted to sell it for like a convenience store to come in, and the community didn't want that. So the community came together, disrupted that, and reclaimed that space and turned it into a community space. And it kind of walked through all the different steps they had to take, including occupying the space at different times, so that way construction crews can come in. And it really walks you through, like, what does this community action look like, and what does the community have to do to support itself across all these different ages and generations as well. So I was very excited to get that story, and it's something I really look for when I'm editing, is making sure that there are those sort of practical stories. And that's because I do believe Solarpunk has the ability to innovate, to encourage people to think about the right tool for the right job. And importantly, it's because we can transition off fossil fuels, right? Like, we have the technology, we have the sustainable technology to do all these things. It's the ideology and culture that are hindering us right now. So if we look at the history of literature in the US and globally as well, we know that stories can shift culture. So right now it's about tapping into that tool and waging that imagination battle, as Adrienne Marie Brown says, to push back against that universal belief. So there's a couple of things that I'm thinking of is what does a culture of adaptation instead of growth look like? And how can we display that in an attractive way through solarpunk stories? How do we stop hand waving away the consequences of solar panels or other sustainable resources or sustainable energy apparatuses, and actually like engage with that and reimagine, like, how can we do this in a way that's equitable to everyone? And then also keeping in mind that it's not going to be individual action that stops climate change. It's going to be communities coming together and adapting to the situation. So ultimately, we need to be shifting from literature and solarpunk to action. And we need to be doing that across all environmental literature, in my opinion, but I think solarpunk is already uniquely positioned to do that, from its purpose of imagining different futures to the practical stories that I know I look for in my anthologies, as well as other editors are looking for. So we really set ourselves up to start thinking about action at this point. So one thing that we can do, and one way that I do this in my own life, is I start thinking about, what does my community need? I really believe that solarpunk needs to have a regional aspect as well as being inspired by the global. I live in a river valley in north central Pennsylvania called Williamsport, and we were hit really hard by the fracking boom. And so there's some certain things that I can already point to that I'm like, all right, I know my community needs these things. River cleanup is a big one, like taking care of our water, which is really messed up after fracking, is an important thing. Community gardens, preparations for superstorms. We've already had extreme flooding in the past that has killed people. So we know that this is going to be in our future in terms of climate change. More affordable housing, community cooling spaces, our heat wave, we're getting heat waves there. Nothing like what you all experience here, but it's enough that it is impacting people, particularly those that do not have air conditioning, because you don't necessarily need it in north central Pennsylvania. Drought protection, we had a really bad drought this summer, and we do have agricultural spaces in that part of Pennsylvania. And then a more emergency food and shelter access. So any of these can become seeds for a story. But you might be thinking, that does not sound like an enjoyable story to read. And so I think one of the important things is to remember the punk and solarpunk. it needs to be fun, right? Like we can't just sit down and write these stories that are about dour ideas or concern or out of a place of fear or scarcity. We've already tried to do the environmental literature take where there's a sense of warning, right? We've been reading books like that from like the 40s even and onward, that's warning us about how we're interacting with our environment. And it hasn't gotten us far enough. So we know we need to move past warning and we need to do something else. And punk, I think, is actually a perfect way to do this. Punk balances the pain and enjoyment of self-expression, right? Like a punk show, there can be anger, there can be frustration, there can be grief at a punk show, but at the same time, there's also community and there's also times a lot of joy, right? And even if it's just a joy in self-expression. So punk has that balance already built into it. And that's one reason why I do argue that punk belongs in Solarpunk, whether it's just for the fun of it, or it's for how do we wrestle with these emotions in a meaningful way and an artful way, which punk gives a lot of people a space to do that. Punk also helps us to think about anti-authoritarianism, anti-establishment, anti-capitalism, and what does individuality look like in the space of community, right? Like there's a lot of community with punk, but also a lot of individualism, and it's a good balance. So I think punk helps us think freed of capitalism, false scarcity, economic survival, what would a good life look like? And if we all went around the room and answered that question would look a little different for everyone. So I have a feeling a lot of us would come back to family, community, friends, at least as part of that answer, right? And that's something that Solarpunk is very good at talking about. But Solarpunk can also show us all these different variations. It doesn't have to all be the same, just like there's a lot of different punk subgenres for however you want to engage with punk music. And this sort of thinking about punk leads us to dual power, which is how I choose to think about sustainable energy culture and sort of how our communities might go in this direction. So we already know that the government response here in the US is very slow and really too slow at this point. And also that they choose economics over people, which frankly shouldn't be that surprising in the US since we have a country built on colonization, genocide, and the enslavement of people. So if we have this history and then we're seeing COVID demonstrated that we chose economy over people yet again, then we need to start thinking about not relying on government responses to climate change and infrastructure changes, whether thinking about sustainable energy, and rather build local autonomy. That is the way that I oftentimes engage with this idea in my Solarpunk stories, and what I'm looking for when I'm reading Solarpunk is looking for local autonomy. How do we shift communities to feeding themselves, clothing themselves, powering themselves, and housing themselves? This is a huge idea, right? Like this is incredibly complicated, incredibly difficult here in the US. But it doesn't mean that we can't do it and that we haven't seen other groups already doing this here in the US. So how does a community survive, and how can stories help us like imagine these pathways and also give us practical ways to start engaging with this? And ultimately, I think it comes back to regional versus global. I do not think Solarpunk should be a universal fix. I think it needs to be a local fix that can help us customize and adapt and think through problems on a local level, while still taking inspiration from the global, right? Like the things that I'm going to experience in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, as climate change continues to impact that area, is going to be very different than some of what Phoenix is going to experience as climate change impacts this place. So how can we move away from a universal response to climate change and instead think about autonomous local autonomy instead? And I was really excited a couple weeks ago, this popped up on my Twitter. I gave a talk about Solarpunk in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I had the joy of meeting someone there who got very excited about Solarpunk. And then a little less than a year later, she is putting out a zine now, thinking about what does Wheeling, West Virginia look like through a Solarpunk lens. And I think that's an ideal way to approach these kind of things. You know, what does my space, what does my community look like through a Solarpunk lens? And how can I work towards that? So I was very excited when this came up, because this is ultimately a way that I think is a great way to engage in Solarpunk thinking and Solarpunk creation. A couple of things that we know already work too when it comes to regional thinking and regional preparation. We know mutual aid networks work. We've seen them work in different situations, particularly during COVID. We saw them once again work very well. I know in East Palestine, mutual aid networks immediately started to help the community after the disaster there when they burned the train. And so we know mutual aid networks are an effective path forward. So we can learn from that and start to enact those in our own communities if there aren't already mutual aid networks meeting the needs that our community has. We also have some historical and recent examples. The Zapatista Army of National Liberation in Mexico is an autonomous space, and they have been functioning that way for a while now. So we know that they have tactics that work. Same with the Black Panther Party. A lot of their tactics work. That's why they put the fear in our government, right? So we have ways that we know we can build community autonomy, and now it's just starting to enact those. We also learn from punk groups, right? There's a whole DIY culture that comes with punk that I think sustainable energy could really benefit from. We can also listen and learn from Indigenous groups, a lot of whom have had sustainable relationships in the past with our environment, with our living world, and Indigenous voices need to continue to be at the forefront of environmental thinking. All right, so I'm going to leave you with just a couple thoughts on Solarpunk action, and then I'll go ahead and open it up to Q&A. So a couple of things. When you're thinking about Solarpunk action in your community, there's a couple of ways to get started. I think just being honest about what skills do you have? Like, what can you bring to the community? Everyone's going to have different things that can come together, and that's important, right? We don't all have to have the same set of skills. What can you contribute individually and communally? And then also, what are the needs in your community? And sometimes this can be hard to know. And I think that's just one of the ways that encourages people to like get out into the community more and figure out what's going on, what needs are met, what needs are there, and what needs to be met. As well as imagining into the future, right? If we're going to adapt to future issues, we need to be thinking what's going to be the issue down the line. And then is there a way to connect the skills that you have with the needs that you see in your own community? So Almanac for the Anthropocene, I was really attempting myself and my co-editor to build a book that was much more of an almanac than unfortunately it ended up being. And I think that shows that we have a gap right now in Solarpunk thinking in the doing, going from stories to doing. And so as much as I wanted a whole book full of examples of Solarpunk action, we have here a few examples that come from this book that I was really happy to get, but I want to like keep encouraging people to have more of this kind of stuff. So some examples that came up in the book that I think Solarpunks are really working with is mending is a big one, right? Being able to sew and just the practical skill of mending that does disrupt consumeristic practices around fashion, right? One of my favorites was Appalachian Solarpunk, growing trees and thinking about growing food-bearing trees that used to be much more available in the US. Of course, foraging, that's become popular right now, just sort of in our culture again, as well as like a lot of people in Solarpunks are thinking about it. Multi-species community garden spaces. So thinking about how can we use abandoned locations or places that aren't being used and turn them into places for not just human usage, but also to support bees, birds, butterflies, other urban creatures, and creating spaces where we can all share that. How to build a solar powered website is really fascinating because it talks about the energy usage of the internet and how we can start to rethink that by like autonomously powering our websites, and kind of walks you through how to do that. There's also a lot of resources on how they did that, how Christy Decker did it. So if that's something that's of interest to you, there's a lot of information in that essay. And then feeding imagination is more of a permaculture essay, talking about food forests, making compost and things like that. So these are some examples of what we found when we were working on this book. And thankfully, I've been seeing it grow on Twitter and on different places, different ideas that people are using, different ways that they're helping their community practically, as well as exploring different technologies to help their communities be more autonomous. And leave you with is the fact that ASU has been doing a lot of this thinking, and it's been really important to doing this thinking. And so like it's really cool for you all here because you have access to these ideas in a way that a lot of people don't, and a lot of people interested in Solarpunk don't. And importantly, City of Lights, a collection of solar futures, is a really great example that we've done a lot of the imagining already. Like we have the technology, we've done the imagining, we've imagined different futures. And what we really need to start doing now is like moving in that direction, right? Like we have all the pieces of the puzzle. Now it's about the cultural shift to start putting things together, which I think is great, right? This is a very encouraging place to be, but now we're starting to shift towards action. So with that, I'll go ahead and open it up to questions. So thank you so much for listening.